In this chapter, we're going to take a look at a concept piece, and we're going to learn how to deconstruct and analyze the concept for when we start an environment in games. We're going to be taking a look at this concept right here from the Elden Ring official art book, and this is going to be the concept that we roll with for the majority of this series, or if not the entirety of the series. One of the questions is, why are we doing this? So we're going to look at this piece, and it's going to drive everything that we're doing for the remainder of these parts. So part 2, 3, 4, 5, however many parts there are, everything we're doing right now is going to help drive that. Firstly, we're going to kind of establish what the mood of this scene is, right? And Elden Ring has a very specific art direction to it, has a very specific lighting, it has specific materials, it has specific ways that they frame scenes so that it really invokes a very similar theme to Diablo in a way that they both sample from a similar style of art, which is kind of like the Baroque art movement of like the 1700s. I believe it's the 1700s. The Baroque art movement where you have these where light is super important. You can see that the scene is just dominated by these areas of darkness right here and these areas of high contrast brightness that are emphasizing the scene and drawing the eye all throughout the scene, right? And that's one of the thing. And with Baroque architecture and Baroque art and even Elden Ring, is it invokes this certain melancholiness to it. And that's one of the words we want to remember as we progress forward. It's like melancholy, right? And I also want people to ask themselves, like, what do they think the concept artist was trying to do when they made this scene? Like, what feelings, when you looked at it, did they want you to feel? Did they want the gamer, the artist, the whoever is looking at this scene to feel like when they saw it? Obviously, if you played Elden Ring, this is a boss arena. This is the boss arena of Loretta, the Knight of the Earl of the Halga Tree. Um, I don't know if it was designed originally to be that. I mean, you can see them kind of in the background here, but and in the in game, as we'll see in a later chapter, this area is massively bigger in the concept than it is in game. Um, but you can tell when we look at it and when we asked ourselves what the concept arts were going for, they wanted very specific motions of and elements of kind of like, not rebirth is the word I'm going to use, elements that kind of showcase this sad face there. uh, Elements of just decay, right? And we're going to remember that word as well. And you'll notice I'm using some very specific words. And you'll notice, like, as an environment artist, one of the things that I typically like to do, and I teach people this all the time, is when I start a scene, I don't try to create 1,000 word, a massive paragraph, or an essay or something on what this scene is, right? Because then you'll get very stuck. You'll get very confused on what you're making. Sometimes you'll accidentally write conflicting things. And what I like to do is, and I believe that if you can't deconstruct a scene into 1 to 5 words, 1 to 5 descriptive words, then you're overthinking it, if that makes sense. You're overthinking the scene and you're overcomplicating it. This is one of those scenes that it's very simple looking, but it's also complicated. But then also on the flip side, you can take a very simple scene and overcomplicate it by overanalyzing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at this scene here, and we're going to go, I already said that one of the main words is decay, and that's a very specific word. Decay, unlike the word, say, broken or old, has a very different definition, right? Decay kind of implies, so like we have our tombstones here, for example, right? Our tombstones are, they look almost pristine, but we know they're not in context of the world. And what these tombstones probably have is you have people who have probably come over, maybe they've, touched them, they put their hands on them, but they they have somewhere, but they don't really look like they've had, like, you know the rain came down on them. They don't look like they have that, or the sun beating down on it, making it sun bleached. Um, but they look like they've been here a long time. They look like just with time they've been left to crumble, and that's, or like this tree here. Normally, in a normal circumstance, trees like this would be dead, where you have covered in cobwebs, covered in um, these giant mushroom-like structures, and then mushrooms everywhere coming out of the vines. Usually, that's pretty indicative of wildlife and foliage that is dying or that is dead, and has been dead and is decaying, right? And that's why I chose that word, because it is invocative. When you think of the word decay, it's very important, and it's very particular word the words you choose, that it shows what, um, it's very indicative of what you're doing. And decay is a very proper word for this scene. One of the other words that I said a few times, you may not know what it is, but it is it is Baroque. Baroque is, like I mentioned before, it's an art movement. It's a very specific art movement, and these words will help us with our references later. Um, so one of the other, as I'm looking at this, I am kind of studying it, and I'm trying to break it down to what I think it should be. And if you're struggling with this part, that's okay. It took me a long time to start doing this. This comes with time, especially, like, I didn't, for a long time I didn't know what Baroque was. Learning and studying art outside of game art is very important. It is very important to go to a museum, look at the aspects there, art history, because otherwise it makes it harder on your. Don't make it harder on yourself. Learn art, learn classical art. One of the other things as I'm looking at this scene is I can see there's a lot of kind of inlay and graphics, and there's a lot of crossing down here. There's some statue work. He's sitting on a podium, and this is kind of just really indicative of classical, like, please excuse my handwriting. This is very indicative of, like, high fantasy, right? Of what we see in things like Dungeons and Dragons, Diablo, and, like, in those kinds of properties. That while Elden Ring is very different and Dark Souls is very different in stylistically, we can see the similarities, and we can see things that are pulling from each other. Where Elden Ring definitely pulls from a more Baroque style than, I wouldn't say than Diablo, because Diablo is, they used Baroque very heavily. Um, but yeah, they cut. It's two different garments cut from the same cloth necessarily. So we're going to leave it at three for now, and we're going to look a little more at this concept. And get rid of that layer. We're going to look a little more here. And one of the last things I want to do, especially for somebody who hasn't really done this before, is I want to break it down into its shapes, right? When you work in environment art and you work with concepts and references a lot, one of the things you kind of get really used to is breaking down scenes into their shapes, right? And you do this kind of subconsciously, and you don't do it visually, but I'm going to do it visually here. Not the entire thing, but I'm going to do it visually to show how you would do it to somebody who's never done it before. So when I'm looking at this scene, it looks kind of complex, right? It looks a little complex, but it also looks simple. One of the things that we need to do is we need to understand that there's four tiers to everything when we make game art, right? There's primary, secondary, tertiary, and small details, right? And that will drive every single thing that we do going forward, whether it's all of the shapes in the scene, whether it's everything, the scene as a whole, or whether it's this tombstone, whether it's these guys right here, whether it's the entire tree, or this statue right here. Every single thing in this scene will live off of that four tier system. Your primary shapes are necessarily going to be your block out, right? They're going to be the shapes that need to be in this scene for the scene to read as what it is, in a sense. They just need to be what is the most basic possible shape you can make out of this scene. One of the things I'll start with is the ground. I always start with the ground. And the reason for that is because we all come from the ground. Everything comes from the ground, right? Trees grow out of the ground. We build structures onto the ground. These rest on the ground. You know, it's one of those weird principles of life that everything just comes from the ground. So always, I will say, like, a lot of times art is subjective, and you don't want to say always, but I'm going to say always start with your ground plane and build up and up from there, because otherwise you're going to be struggling a lot. And what I mean by that is, say you have this guy and you build him first, you're going to be struggling to figure out how far in relation this ground plane goes from him. And vice versa. Everything in the scene is going to struggle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the scene and I go, what is the most basic shape that makes up the ground of this scene? And kind of right away, you can just see that it curves in this way that kind of just comes around like that. And pull that in here. You know what? Actually, that's way too jagged for what we're doing. We literally are just going to pull it in there. And you can kind of look at it right away and see, like, if you've done 3D before, if you've done art before, you can see that it's just the head of a cylinder, right? Like, that's the shape that we're going for. We're going for the most primary basic shapes. If you're going higher than a cube that's maybe slightly manipulated, or a cylinder, or maybe a sphere, or a prism, or what have you, if you're going higher than those items, then you're going too far. These are the most basic shapes imaginable, and I'll take it a step further. So we have our ground plane right here, and then we're going to look at this guy, because to me, the two most prominent things in this scene right now are this thing and our tree right here, with this guy and all of this being secondary. Don't worry, we're gonna block it all in. I'm just explaining, like, what layer of importance. So I'm gonna start with over here on the left. When I look at this, I'm not gonna look at, like, okay, so we start down here and we come up and it curves and it stops here. I'm not even gonna acknowledge that this is open. I'm not gonna acknowledge that there's anything in this area. Or this curve, or this little buckle here, or the holes here. I'm not going to acknowledge any of that. So I'm actually going to start here. I'm going to draw a perfectly straight line up to there, a perfectly straight line down to there. I'm going to connect it, and you can notice that's just a triangle. And this is a cube that I've, say, turned on its 90 degrees, and I've elongated this section right here. I've pulled it up. And then for when I do this, right now, I'm not going to worry about him at all. I'm not going to worry about his podium. I'm not going to worry about this branch coming out. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this. I'm going to find the spot where it's closest to the ground, as close as what it looks like to the ground. I'm going to hold shift after clicking this. I'm going to hold shift and draw another line down. I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to do a rough approximation of where I think it is. Go there, and I'm going to draw a line. And I'm going to imagine this is just a flat face. And the reason I'm doing that is because I just need the form of the shape. in its most rough, basic shape so that I can build from it, right? I can build from it. I can build on top of it. I can build out of it. I can eventually what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace everything that's here as I go on. And we just kind of continue this out, right? Like we just kind of build this here. This comes out here, down. He goes all the way down there. He goes out the same spot. He goes across. And notice I'm just building cubes at this point. I'm just building cubes on cubes on cubes because that's all what blockouts are. But they're very, very important to game art as a whole and the silhouettes that I want to make. But one of the things you're going to notice kind of right away when I do this part is I'm going to go across and I'm just going to do another triangle. And we're going to do a lot of repeating shapes. And one of the things that you're going to notice as we're doing it is that there is a lot of repeating shapes. Even if they're covered by like, stuff right here, this is probably reused over here. All of this is reused over here as well. This, even though it's not seen, I bet you there's probably one of these right here. And and it's not just exclusive over here. So like if I imagine that the tree is coming down from the outer layer of the ground plane, I'm not going to draw the curve. I'm just going to hit one dot there. I'm going to imagine it goes over there. And then I'm going to do a straight line right there. Imagine this comes up from right here. And then close that off. I'm going to draw basically a bell shape of just a kind of rough approximation of where that tree totally encompasses. And I'm going to do the same thing here. And I'm not going to even worry about this branch yet. This might even, like, if you notice I bent it twice, this might even be too complex for a blockout. But you can see what I'm doing. I'm just building this scene down into the most basic forms of what this is. And we're going to take this and we're going to look at it. We're going to say, okay, there's a lot of repeating notions here, right? Like we have, like if we turn this off really quick, we have this guy right here. We have this guy right here, this guy right here, this guy, this pillar are all almost exactly the same. There might be there's some small differences here where this has an arch, this has an arch, this one does not, and this one does not. But we can use that information to kind of inform decisions later in the planning stage. One of the other things noticed was this kind of has a vertical cross hatching. This does not, has like a swirl effect here. But for the most part, they're exactly the same on different sides, even though it doesn't, there's like a weird perspective problem. You can't really see, anything's happening here, right here. But using context clues, you can probably justify that it's doing the same thing. Or you can see that these reused patches are going to be used again over here and here and here and here. Or even down here. Like you can tell there's a lot of reusability in this scene. And why I'm pointing this out is we're going to use that information when we go into part or chapter 3 when we build our block out. When we build our block out and we plan out what it is we're going to do and we plan out what it is that we're going to kind of readjust and replicate. Because one of the biggest things in a scene like this is what can we reuse? What can we optimize? So, for example, a little spoiler ahead of time, one of the ways that I would go about doing these is, and you've noticed they're all different, I wouldn't make three different ones, or I wouldn't make four different ones. So we have this guy and this guy. They're exactly the same. So I would make these two exactly that, exactly the same. And what I would do is we don't see the backside of this pillar, right? If we would imagine it, it has an arch on one side, and we don't see the backside. We were left to assume that there's either an arch or it's blank in the backside. This one has what looks like it kind of has an inner square and some scribiness here. What we can do is we can actually make this on the backside of this and just rotate it where we need it, where we need it to be different. Or if we notice that this camera, if this is the main camera we end up using, which we should if we're following the reference, but we'll get to that a little later. This one is also slightly different. It looks like it has the this one does, but it looks flat on the face. If we want to destroy it a little more, then we can make it the back side of this pillar from the camera. So this would be on this side, on the other side behind this wall. This one would be on this side. So we would have essentially 4 different sides of the same pillar that we can rotate at our leisure to face the camera and face the player. And it's going to be little details like that. And this is why we're noticing and analyzing this now so that we can do all these things. All of this information that we're going through, whether it's the words that we've deciphered or whether it's the things we've broken down into their basic forms, or the things that we've looked at in their reusability, which we'll look at a little more later when we get to our blockouts, are going to inform decisions we make, whether it's in parts 1, 2, 3, or 4. This is arguably the most important stage. And with that, we're going to kind of leave it here, and we're going to go into chapter 2, which is how to go about reference gathering.